Um, I've heard of several students have reported COVID, and also I know some profs who have it, so I guess it's still going around. Um, okay, today we're going to be looking at the Ottoman Empire. That's the main theme of today's work. Um, I Before I get there, though, I want to make sure that we have dealt with the last review questions that we were concerned with. And so, turning to the sheet with the review questions, um, start at question 10, which is concerns the French monarchy. And I dealt with that, and I'm not going to do um, more on that because it's recorded and it's available. But I didn't deal fully with Louis XIV, so I just want to recapitulate briefly Louis XIV's contribution to the buildup of the French monarchy. That's what I'm talking about. Question 10. The sequence begins with Charles VII, Francis I, Henry IV, Louis XIII, and now Louis XIV. So, to recollect this, we note that the key thing is the intendant, these officials that are sent into the provinces. They break the local power of the nobility, of the independent towns, of the courts. These royal agents who have full powers are key to fully instituting centralized authority. And so, with Louis XIV, you see that the independent power of the nobles, which goes back deep into the Middle Ages, this is now ended by centralized monarchy. And this is, of course, symbolized by the construction of Versailles, as I explained, and all of the leading nobles are essentially put into this gilded cage, golden cage. It's golden, it's very pleasant. It reminds me of one of the diarists who kept an account of what was going on at the court. And if you go to the gardens of Versailles after these incredible banquets and dinners, the nobles would stroll in the gardens, and so he records, the diarist, that one of the nobles turned to the other and says, "This is all magnificent, this is all wonderful, and so on, but alas, when will we live? When we're not really living, we're living in a kind of fantasy, and so on." And so the other noble turns to him and responds, "Our servants will do that for us." In other words, the footmen and those who wait on them and so on, they have real lives, and they will tell us about what it is like to have a real life. So the noble local power is broken, Versailles is created, and Versailles becomes the center of not merely French culture, but European culture. And the power of Louis XIV is exemplified by the fact that he really completely controls the Catholic Church in France. And indeed, he makes the Pope actually his puppet. The Popes in Italy, because Louis XIV has so much power that the Pope in Rome has to sort of politically conform to whatever Louis XIV is saying. And for good measure, he ends the toleration of the Protestants. They are forced to convert, and if they don't convert, they have to leave. And beyond that, the economy is built up to create the great army and navy, unprecedentedly large army and navy. mercantilism is fully developed by Colbert, who explained he sponsors the French trading companies in Asia, in India, in North America. The French developed not only Quebec, but they're trading into Western Canada and down the Mississippi River Valley. A kind of French empire is created in the New World. And finally, of course, in the Caribbean, the French sugar plantations alongside the Dutch and the English and the Spaniards, especially Santa Dominica, which is eventually half of it turns into Haiti, which becomes the biggest of the French sort of sugar plantation colonies. 500,000 slaves in the 18th century working on 5,000 sugar plantations. It's key to the sort of prosperity of the monarchy in the 18th century. So all of this and then also expresses itself in the great army and navy, and it's all part of this endeavor to sort of dominate the whole of Europe. Which brings us to the next question, and that basically asks you, I guess it's phrased, Louis XIV, like the Spanish Habsburgs, aspired to dominate all of Europe. The spoiler in each case was England. And what you need here is the contrast between the aspiration for hegemony, imperial control, that emanated from Charles V and Philip II, in contrast to the idea of the balance of power in Europe. The idea that there are these sovereign territorial states, and the chief exponent of this practice of balance of power politics are the English. And so you could start with Charles V. He had the New World, he had the bullion, he had this great Spanish army, but he was resisted by the French and the English. It continues with Elizabeth. Elizabeth resists Philip II's drive to conquer the whole of Europe in the name of the restoration of the Catholic Church. He, of course, has the powers that his father has given him, but also he is endorsed by the popes and the Counter-Reformation. And of course, the counter becomes the defeat of the Spanish Armada by the English. It's the English who defeat the attempt to establish this hegemony. So now coming to Louis XIV, the answer here is going back to what I said in answer to the previous question. You say something about the buildup of the French state under Louis XIV. Then you talk about the buildup, particularly of the army and the navy, and the fact that Louis XIV had, since 1672, continuous war in Europe in an attempt to dominate using these immense military resources. But again, it was the English, with their increasingly strong capitalism, which translates into even greater military power than the French, superior armies and navies. And at the end of the day, capitalism defeats feudalism and absolutism. So the last question you want to deal with, that we're dealing with here today, is question 12. Explain the context of the English Revolution and civil wars of the 17th century. Well, here you start off by saying England became this powerful capitalist state in the 16th century, continuing in the 17th century. And with that, England developed a very strong middle class, as I explained in the last lecture, the class which was basically developing this capitalist society, and that furthermore, the leading elements of this were Calvinists or Puritans, and um, so it's capitalism, it's the middle class, it's the Puritan middle class, and the institution through which they begin to express their aspirations is the development of the English Parliament in the 16th century. So you discuss the development of the Parliament under Henry VIII, the Reformation, the fact that Henry raises money through the Parliament and so on. This continues under Elizabeth. But then, as I explained last time, there begins, even in the midst of this growing success on the part of the English government, the Parliament begins to express criticism of the monarchy, already under Elizabeth, about foreign policy, about her church policy, which is too conservative for the Puritans, that she's spending too much money, and so on. And this comes to full expression under the new dynasty of the 17th century, the Stuart kings, James I, and then Charles I. And I explained that under James, there is a running battle between the Parliament and the king over taxes, over the fact that the king is trying to control economic life, and the middle class wants free trade and laissez-faire economics. They don't want the market controlled. They don't want the king interfering with enclosures. The king is giving monopolies to various businessmen that he likes and so on, which is not fair, not free competition. They criticize him for that. But also, they want reform of the church. And they're critical. He's too friendly to the Catholic powers. And moreover, there's this decadence in the court. Those are the issues. And then in 1625, he's succeeded by his son, Charles I, and in a succession of 3 parliaments, all the relationship between the king and the parliament completely breaks down over these issues. The king suspends the parliament in 1628, and that suspension lasts for 10 years until 1638. He tries to bring in French and Spanish absolutism. He's going to rule by himself. And in particular, he raises tax money without the consent of the parliament. He begins a purge of the Puritans in the church and in the universities. But he takes a step too far because his advisors convince him that he should do the same thing up in Scotland. And the Scots are very, they're Puritan fanatics. And when the king's representatives present themselves in Edinburgh, they are essentially arrested, and war breaks out, and the king tries to raise an army, but the army, which is being raised in the provinces, in the shires, it mutinies against Charles I, and so essentially revolution breaks out in 1640, and I explained that England became a republic. Charles, in fact, was beheaded by decree of the Parliament, and they tried to establish a republic, but the fear of democracy and the fact that the old landlord class was resisting led them eventually to reach a compromise. And Charles II came to power in 1660, but you have basically now a constitutional monarchy in England. And the ultimate sovereignty in the state, especially the taxing powers, the power of the purse, lies in the House of Commons. And the House of Commons, you have to understand, is what somebody has called the executive committee of the middle class, of the bourgeoisie. It's the people who sit in the House of Commons are essentially members of the capitalist class. The most prestigious are sitting in the House of Commons. They are the executive committee of the whole class, who now dominate English society. And that is the form of government that England has continued to have until, indeed, the characteristic representative constitutional government is essentially this form. The representative body, the members of it, are influential members of the middle class, usually lawyers, who work for large business interests. And that's essentially the form that we have. Now, so that's the three questions to be dealt with. But I want to sort of generalize and talk a little bit about what is a revolution. Before we get into the Ottomans, I just want to sort of abstract from what we've been talking about and talk a little bit about what is a revolution, because revolution is a absolutely characteristic of European history and indeed world history from the 16th century onward. It actually starts in Germany. Remember, I mentioned the Peasants' War, and the peasants attempt to overthrow feudalism, and they're crushed. But really, the first expression and full expression of this, successful one, is Holland. I said that was the first successful middle-class revolution. But we see now there's a second middle-class revolution that occurs in England, and we're going to see by the end of these lectures that there is yet another third great middle-class revolution. That is to say, in France. And of course, revolutions continue into the 19th and through the 20th century. So it's important to sort of understand what it's all about. Well, in analyzing a state or polity, you realize, and I think you understand this, that there is what we call the social and economic base of society. The economy, so important. And then the class structure that emerges out of the economy, the social relationships that exist. And of course, historically, it's been, these have been based on classes. So we have economy and society, that's the base of society. And then there is the state on top. And the state, in a way, reflects what is going on below. So this is referred to as the base and the superstructure. Politics, the state, is the superstructure. It's the administrative legal structure which reflects the real social and economic relations that are below. And certainly, in terms of your sort of understanding of the contemporary, it's for you, because they don't explain this to you, to figure out constantly what is the relationship between what is going on at the political level and what's going on underneath in terms of the relationships that I've described, economic and social. Well, a revolution begins to, a situation begins to develop when the social and economic development that is going on below begins to collide with the superstructure above. In other words, the state begins to become an obstacle to the full development of the social and economic forces that are operating below. And a kind of conflict begins to develop between the state, which is seen as an obstacle, particularly by the most dynamic forces that are emerging. And in the case that we've been dealing with, it's capitalism, it's the middle class, their aspirations that begin to be frustrated. In the case of the Dutch, you see the collision with the Habsburg monarchy. In the case of England, it's the aspiring middle class embodied in parliament beginning to fight the king. So a revolution, what happens is that the superstructure is overthrown. The state as it existed is overthrown, and a new state is created, a new superstructure, which is more in accord with the real forces, the most dynamic, the strongest forces, socially and economically. And in particular, in these three great revolutions, these are middle class revolutions. Because at the end of the day, instead of the landlord class or the absolute monarchy or the church controlling the state, it is the parliament. It is the sort of constitutional regime which comes to power, and that happens in Holland, and it happens in England, and eventually it's going to happen in France as well. So that's basically what a revolution is all about. And of course, it's important to know this because revolution is a characteristic, as I say, of the 19th and the 20th, and continuing even into the century that we're now living in. And I would say that, well, one question that does emerge is revolution inevitable? Certainly not. It is possible for there to be reform, and we have many, many examples of this conflict between the base and the superstructure emerging, but a reform program is introduced by the leaders of the state. The state have a sense of what's going on, and they introduce reforms which basically change the state so that it accommodates these social and economic questions below. And of course, the classic examples are the English experience is the leading example of this. Basically, England was faced many times with the threat of reform. One thinks, particularly in the 19th century, in 1832, there was the whole issue was Parliament was, as I've explained, Parliament was basically the preserve of the wealthiest in English society. The middle class and the working class were excluded from voting. You could not vote in England if you were a member of the working class or the lower middle class. You had no vote, and so with the Industrial Revolution, this reached a critical point, and there was revolution on the continent of Europe, and it spread to England, and the lower classes, both the middle class and the working class, were on the verge of revolution. Well, the English government, in the face of this, capitulated and introduced a Reform Act, which basically broadened the franchise. So this is an example of that. Or we could take the example of, say, the 1930s. As you probably know, the capitalist economy collapsed all over the world in the 1930s, and nowhere more so. It began, actually, in the United States, this collapse. I mean, a total collapse. And in the face of this, there were growing radical elements in the society. It looked like capitalism was finished. But we did have a far-sighted capitalist executive, Roosevelt, who brought in a whole series of reform rather than revolution. And these reforms, restructuring of both the state and also introducing all sorts of sort of social and economic measures, that basically tampered down the revolutionary elements that were developing in American society. And I would say that reform is still possible today. For example, in Canada, yes, I think the Liberals in partnership with the NDP have been and continue to bring in essentially liberal or social democratic reforms. And they know very well that this is necessary because you saw the truckers and so on, and we know that this element is getting stronger in the society. and they're going to respond by bringing in piecemeal whatever they can. But we also see that in the case of, say, the United States, that is over in the United States. The possibility of reform is not possible in that society. It's gone too far, particularly the social inequality. And so we're beginning to see the possibility that the state could actually be overthrown. And my personal belief is that likely it will be overthrown. The republic will be overthrown in the United States. But we'll see. I could be wrong. I don't know. But so I'm just giving you this picture. Okay. So let's continue now. And I want to turn now to the Ottoman Empire. So we've looked at Latin America. We've been dealing a lot with Europe, and now we're looking at the Ottoman Empire. And essentially, of course, the Ottoman Empire dominated the whole of the Middle East. To the south and east, across the Mediterranean from Europe, lay the Middle East. Very important, the Mediterranean, beginning of the 16th century, it's still the main route to India and China. The whole trading pattern of Eurasia is through the Mediterranean. And the Middle East is along that main route, the Mediterranean and the Middle East. And this new, very powerful, centralized Muslim state arises and comes to dominate the whole of the Middle East. I'm talking about, of course, the traditional center, Iraq, Syria, Palestine, Jordan. But beyond that, of course, Anatolia, which is the present state of Turkey, Turkey, but also North Africa. The whole of North Africa becomes part of the Ottoman state, and their power extends down along the coasts of the Arabian Peninsula and up into the Caucasus, and even southern Ukraine and southern Russia become part of the Ottoman Empire. The Balkans, Greece and places like Bulgaria, Albania, Romania, that's all part of the Ottoman Empire. It's enormous, way bigger than any European state, way bigger. It's an enormous entity, and it's centralized. The base of the Ottoman army is enormous. The population at the beginning of the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire, the population was estimated 30 million people. Well, the French state, which is the largest of the European states, only has about 18 million people. So the Ottoman state is almost double the size of the French state. And as I say, it's centralized. It's a centralized government. And I just wanted to sort of mention some of the key elements of the way it was organized. First of all, unlike in Europe, the ruler of the state and the ruler of the religion, of the institutionalized religion, we're dealing with Islam, of course, the ruler was the Sultan, but also he was the Caliph. He was the religious leader as well as the political leader. So there was a union of church and state, which of course was not true in Western Europe during the Middle Ages. There was the Pope and there was the Emperor, and there was a certain separation. But no, in the Ottoman state, the two, church and state, go hand in hand. Moreover, not only did the Sultan control the religious institutions, but also the economy was carefully controlled by the state as well. Prices and wages the markets, in other words, were highly regulated by the government. This was regulated. It was a market economy. There was manufacturing. There were merchants, but what they could do was clearly limited by the very strong state that existed. And furthermore, I would say that Whereas in Europe, what you see all over Europe, and England is an example, is that you have independent economic classes. You have an independent landlord class that have real vested property rights in the land. Ultimately, legally, uh, certainly as our period begins, they don't have absolute property rights. That only happens in England at the end of the revolution. But they do have, these landlords have a lot of traditional rights to hold on to their land. And likewise, merchants have, their personal property. Peasants have a certain security of tenure, I would say. Whereas in the Ottoman Empire, in theory, all the property belongs to the Sultan. In theory. I mean, in practice, it's a different story, but still, law counts. It's important. And in this setup, you can see that the ruler, the Sultan, has huge authority, even social and political authority. Now, this kind of society is sometimes referred to as the Asiatic mode of production, and we see similar kind of arrangements in India, for example, or even in China uh, in the Middle Ages and into the early modern period. This setup, not completely or fully, but what we see is similar. Now, this structure was extremely cohesive and very powerful, and certainly faced with this extremely powerful Ottoman state that emerged in the 16th century based on Islam and a tradition of jihad or crusade against those who did not accept the Islamic religion, Muhammad, and so on, his teachings, this tradition of military conquest. The Europeans were terrified at the emergence of such a powerful state. They had been fighting the Muslims for centuries and centuries, and now suddenly there is this new danger. Possibly they could overrun all of Europe, and we do know that, say, in 1529, a huge Islamic army coming from Istanbul basically reached the gates of Vienna in 1529, and Charles V had to send a huge army in order to prevent Vienna from falling to the Turks. So that was the situation, basically that existed at the beginning of the 16th century. And for good measure, I think I mentioned this, for when the Ottomans took over for a while, for about 20 years, between about 1460 and 80, trade across the Mediterranean was impeded, was blocked by virtue of the antagonism between the Europeans and the Ottomans. Thankfully, the Ottoman Sultan realized, hey, this trade is really important to the economic life of the empire, and so it was resumed. But still, it gives you an idea of the threat. Well, this gives you sort of a certain outline of the basic structure. But I want to say that there are certain problems in terms of sort of doing justice to the Ottoman Empire from the point of view, if we're looking at it from, and we, for the most part, most of us come out of the European tradition and the West, it is difficult in a certain way to sort of get into the heads, understand the dynamics, the sort of cultural dynamics of this Ottoman society. And that comes out of the fact that religion is so important. And it was important in the 16th century, and it continued to be important right through the history of the Ottoman Empire. And this is a religious culture. And of course, we see that even today in the Middle East, religion plays a key role. And the problem is that, from a point of view of studying, is that in the West, certainly, as you've already seen, the whole question of religion was central. 16th century people, this is their central cultural concern is religion. And so on, you see that the big issue of the 16th century is religion, Catholic or Protestant, and so on. And certainly, wherever you lived, there was an official church, whether it was Protestant or Catholic, and you had to belong to that church. So there was an overlap between church and state in Europe. But as time wore on, religion, and you begin to see this already with, say, somebody like Henry IV, Paris is worth a mass, so a more casual attitude begins to develop. And indeed, by the 17th century, certain philosophers are beginning to become skeptical about religion, thinking of somebody like Spinoza, official religion, and so on. Well, in the 18th century, an open opposition, cultural opposition began to develop between church and state in European society. Nowhere more so than in France, but it was very pervasive, and we'll come back to this. And then, with the American Revolution of 1776, and then the French Revolution of 1789, both of those revolutions, in terms of their restructuring, they drew a clear line between church and state. There could be no state religion. People could freely practice their religion. The state took no position when it came to religion. Separation of church and state became a fundamental political idea, particularly in the liberal tradition, which was the dominant position. Separate, and you see, for example, in the history of a country like Canada, a large part of the political life of a country like Canada, or we could see this in the states of Latin America, is the struggle between those who accepted and promoted the idea of separation of church and state. Religion is a private matter, etc. And those who resisted it and basically called for the retention of the idea that church and state should be one and the same thing. But at the end of the day, by the end of the 19th century, the liberal idea triumphed, and it continues to triumph as a basic principle, separation of church and state, and that, of course, eventually promoted what we call secularism. Basically, you see a certain decline of religious influence over time, decline, and the society becomes increasingly secular. Religious belief, it persists, but it becomes, as I say, a private matter, and certainly institutionally, religion progressively loses, not entirely, but it loses its grip on Western society. Contrast that with the situation in the Middle East, where, as I say, there is this fusion of church and state, and where there is this persistence of religiosity right down to the present. In some ways, we could say in recent years, even an intensification of religious identity has occurred. Now, so that, and of course, in the West, in a way, the attitude of the Westerners toward what is going on in the Middle East is very sort of skeptical and so on, and critical. It seems like the people in the Middle East are religiously fanatic, and this is their preoccupation, and that explains their, in terms of Western prejudice, why they're so backward, why they take such a backward attitude towards, for example, the status of women. They're so restrictive when it comes to the rights of women and so on. Religion is the problem. Well, in a certain way, we could say that these are stereotypes. These are stereotypes. If you look more closely at the Middle East, and you look at what is really going on at the grassroots, a different picture emerges. And we can say, for example, we know, because the history of this has been written, that right through the 19th century, in the Middle East, in what was still the Ottoman Empire, there were continuous struggles to basically move toward a more secular society. Secular forces operated and have continued to operate. So much so that we see in, for example, in the 20th century, I would say that in the Middle East, it wasn't until we can say the 1970s, I wouldn't say that religion was the sort of dominant sort of force. It was rather radical nationalism, radical Arab nationalism, which was a secular. Well, it picked up most of the elements of Western sort of radicalism and nationalism. That was the dominant force, but I would even point to the fact that in the Middle East, in Iran, Iraq, and the Sudan, in those countries, they had the largest communist parties outside of the Soviet Union. It was in these three countries that you see the largest communist party. So clearly, people were not simply thinking in religious terms. In other words, they were perfectly capable of understanding things from a political and a social perspective. And there was a scholar, an Arab scholar by the name of Edward Said, who wrote a very important book called Orientalism, and it was published in the 1970s. His name is given in the keywords, Edward Said, and he wrote a book called Orientalism, and basically it's a study of Western stereotypes of people in the Middle East. He calls these stereotypes Orientalism. And this is a great book. It's a masterly piece of work, and I recommend it to you. This whole question of religion, as I'm saying, is an issue in terms of fully understanding what's going on in this region of the world. Now, as it happens, it's true that at the beginning of the period that we're dealing with, the Ottoman Empire, I think one could make a fair case that it was the strongest state in this whole area. If you include the Middle East and Europe, it probably was the strongest state from certainly a political and military point of view. Most cohesive, most centralized. The central government had immense resources, and these expressed itself in formidable military capacity. But after the 16th century, things did not go well. And so slowly over time, the Ottoman Empire became sick, you can say. That is to say, it entered into a kind of decay. And this decay, it didn't reform itself effectively. Remember, I spoke about it. It didn't reform itself effectively. And moreover, and this is an important point, because there were no real independent economic classes, the capacity of internally of the Ottoman state to experience revolution out of the question. Couldn't happen. What happened in Holland, what happened in England, what was going to happen in France was inconceivable in the Ottoman state. And therefore, the Ottoman state failed to experience this restructuring until it was more or less too late. And so the Ottoman Empire became what was called from the late 18th century onward, the sick man of Europe. The Ottoman Empire is sick. It's getting weaker and weaker and weaker, and it might eventually die. Well, the end of the story is, of course, that after centuries of this kind of decay, the Sultan was ultimately overthrown in 1922, and a revolution occurred, a middle-class revolution. and they got rid of the Sultan and they established a republic, as some of you might know. But we're talking about 5 centuries. So the problem of the decadence of the Ottoman, while Europe is forging ahead, the basic idea is progress. In the Ottoman Empire, it's this, just chronic decay is the thing that needs to be explained. Having said that, I want to end on a more positive note, and that is we have to understand that, first of all, the Ottoman state, as I'm describing it at the beginning of the 16th century, in its heyday, was part of a great Islamic revival that was going on at that time. Because not only do you see this powerful Islamic state in the Mediterranean, but also next door in Persia, there is a powerful monarchy. And in India, it is the Muslims who rule, the Mughals, who are Muslim. They rule. And so you have these 3 great Eurasian empires, they're all Muslim. Furthermore, the Muslims have huge influence along the coast of both East Africa and West Africa. The merchant class tends to be Muslim in both East and West Africa. The Muslims are busy converting people in southern Burma, in the Philippine Islands. The whole of Indonesia eventually becomes Muslim. So Islam is dynamic. We can say certainly Europe was dynamic, but so was Islam in the 16th century. We can say that. And then the other thing we should remember before we finish is the fact that, yes, the Ottomans were in a way a new ruling elite that took over the Middle East. But before them, the Arabs had ruled independently for centuries. From the 7th century onwards, there were 2 great caliphates, Arab caliphates, from the 7th to the 11th century. And during that period, we can say that truly the Islamic Middle East, this region was the center of the world because it was the focal point, all highways, all roads, all economic life, such as it was, passed through the Middle East. There was a great dynamism, especially in the cities. And therefore, there were these powerful Arab empires, and the cultural achievements were considerable. Consider the invention of algebra, which is an Arabic word. Consider the development of optics, the development of astronomy, the development of architecture by the Arabs during this period. And furthermore, and lastly, the Greek and Roman empires had disappeared with the end of antiquity. But many of their manuscripts and so on were left around and so on. And it was essentially Arab scholars who translated Aristotle and Plato. And it was through the Arab culture that these great philosophers and other writers were transmitted to the West. The West, in terms of its own development, was based on these accomplishments by Arab culture. So all of this has to be borne in mind as background to what I'm going to say about the history of the Ottoman Empire as we proceed. Thank you.